We're using water-based clay here, and water-based clay can be in a variety of states depending on how we treated it throughout this process and what kind of water-based clay you are working with as well. I'm talking about the clay on my sculpture, not the clay in my hand, by the way. A good water-based clay is going to have a really long period of time where it's rather firm, but not so dry that it begins cracking. Only experience can tell you which clay is going to behave in this fashion, of course. Often when a clay is too wet, it turns into mud, and then it instantly becomes too dry, shrinking and cracking. Now, luckily for me, we have a very lovely local Tuscan clay that I use, which has great properties for making sculpture. I have a lot more information about clay and what types of clay and clay brands that I recommend in the FAQ post on my Patreon page, which you can check out for free, and there's a link in the description below to that post. So this clay is great for what we are doing because it stays in this middle state, where it's not moist and soft, yet not too dry either, just firm to the touch, kind of like leather, and this is the state we want it to be in when modeling. All the information we have spent a lot of effort setting up so far is not going to move anywhere as we apply more clay over the top of it because of this feature. If the clay was too soft, then we can push it around when applying new clay over the top of it. Ideally, I want the clay sculpture to be leather hard by the time I do this final finishing pass. It makes for a much easier time where dinging the sculpture and damaging it is not something we really need to concern ourselves with too much. A leather-hard clay sculpture also allows you the chance to apply your new clay with a bit of force and firmness, something that is required in order to make the new clay lie down evenly. The clay being too wet would mean no such pressure could be applied without distorting what is underneath. There is, of course, the other side of the coin here, which is the state of the clay that we use for modeling as well. The clay that's in your hand, that you're applying to your sculpture. And this also merits a discussion. If this clay is too dry, it won't stick to our clay sculpture. You'll notice this really fast, of course, if you're running into this issue, as you'll have a hard time bonding the new layer to the older surface. If you find yourself here, then reach for fresher clay. The other end of the spectrum would be using clay that is too wet. While this is not necessarily an issue, it can make life a little more difficult for us. Clay that is too wet will have a harder time being applied in a smooth fashion, leading to a way more chiseled wood look than if we were to use slightly drier clay. We will also have the issue of too wet clay kind of fussing up on us when we attempt to run our rakes and loops over those chisel-like marks in the clay. We can circumvent this issue by simply leaving the chisel-like marks there for a little bit until the clay has dried a touch on the surface of our sculpture. But of course, this is not ideal. So ideally, we are modeling using clay that is right in between firm and wet. This kind of clay will lay down nicely and evenly simply using the wood tool and will lend itself towards creating a smooth and unified surface. Because it will lay down nicely using a wood tool for the most part, we have to use a lot less of our rakes and loop tools, and this is a nice time-saving benefit. The drier clay will also instantly be ready to be burnished and lightly sanded by a rake or a loop without having to wait for it to firm up more. And while this is less important, I do find it to be a nice feature that takes a little bit of the concentration effort needed out of the picture. Controlling the moisture level in the clay is a fairly organic process that has no straightforward answer to it. Nothing that I can really tell you that's going to teach you how to do it. The way that I deal with it is I like to grab a hunk of clay and keep it in my hand while modeling. This means I can always get more clay from my offhand, my non-tool holding hand, whenever I need to, instead of going back into the bag. Holding the clay in my hand also draws out a bit of the moisture in the clay, which is beneficial since it means I can control the moisture level in my clay. And usually the clay out of the bag is a little bit too wet. And so keeping it in my hand, I can firm it up a little bit. I can also feel with my hand, or in my hand rather, how firm or soft the clay is and replace the clay when it becomes too firm, too dry. Clay that is too wet out of the bag will have its moisture drawn out of it by the action of me holding it in my hand and kneading it a bit as well. I can, by doing so, keep really good control over the firmness or softness of the clay that I am using to model with, and be prepared for what will eventually happen once I start using it as well. I can develop my own idiosyncratic preference for how I like my clay to be when I model, and I can understand and control this to a T by simply holding the clay in my hand and feeling how the clay feels.